You didn't ask again. Not because you received an answer, and not because the question lost relevance. You didn't ask again because the moment moved on, as if the question had already served its purpose. It wasn't dismissed. It wasn't corrected. It was acknowledged just enough to allow everything else to continue. At the time, that felt sufficient. The first question hadn't been urgent. It wasn't framed to demand clarity. It was more of a check than a challenge, something offered lightly, with room for interpretation. The response didn't close the topic, but it didn't invite continuation either. And in that space, between acknowledgement and engagement, you chose not to ask again. It didn't feel like a decision. There was no internal debate, no calculation of cost or consequence. The conversation had shifted. The window narrowed. Asking again would have required bringing the moment back to a place it no longer occupied, so you let it pass. From the outside, nothing appeared unfinished. The exchange still made sense. The interaction remained smooth, which made silence feel appropriate. You didn't ask again, because repeating the question would have changed the tone. It would have introduced insistence, where there had been none. It would have asked for precision, when the moment seemed content with approximation, and you didn't want to impose. There's a difference between curiosity and insistence, between checking and pressing, between asking once and asking again. The second question always carries more weight. It suggests that the first wasn't enough, that the response didn't settle anything, that something remains unresolved. You weren't sure that was true, or maybe you weren't sure. You wanted it to be true. So you stayed with the assumption that if it mattered, it would surface again on its own. Important things tend to do that, or so you believed, but it didn't return. The topic didn't reemerge. The moment didn't reopen itself. The question remained where it was asked, unanswered but not rejected. You didn't ask again. And in doing so, you allowed the silence to stand in for resolution. That silence didn't feel heavy. It didn't demand attention. It blended easily into everything that followed, which made it difficult to question. Time passed without incident. Other questions took its place. Other concerns required attention. And yet occasionally, you noticed the absence, not as regret, not as frustration, just as a faint awareness that something had been left incomplete. You began to recognize how often not asking again becomes the default response. The first question establishes interest. The second establishes importance. And you had learned to stop at interest, not because you lacked concern, but because concern felt like a commitment. Asking again would have required staying with uncertainty, allowing discomfort to remain unresolved, accepting the possibility that the answer might complicate things. You didn't ask again because silence kept everything balanced. It preserved momentum. It avoided disruption. It allowed the interaction to end cleanly. From the outside, it looked like restraint, like consideration, like someone who knew when not to press. And for a long time, that interpretation held. But over time, you began to notice how often you relied on that same logic. Each time a response felt incomplete. Each time a pause suggested something unsaid. Each time the opportunity to ask again appeared. You let it pass, not because you were satisfied, but because you weren't sure what would happen if you weren't. The cost of asking again was always clearer than the cost of not asking. Asking again risked awkwardness, risked misalignment, risked revealing that you were still thinking about it when everyone else had moved on. Not asking again cost nothing immediately, which made it easy to choose. You didn't ask again, and nothing broke. No tension surfaced. No relationship shifted. No outcome changed, which made the decision feel validated. But decisions don't always reveal their impact right away. Sometimes they shape behavior quietly. They adjust expectations. They narrow the range of responses you consider available. You began to notice how quickly questions dissolved into assumptions. If the answer wasn't clear, you filled in the space yourself. If the response felt incomplete, you treated it as final, not because it was, but because returning to it felt disproportionate. You didn't ask again, and over time, that became a habit, the habit of accepting partial clarity, of letting silence settle questions, of interpreting non-engagement as closure. It didn't feel like avoidance. It felt like efficiency. Why ask again if the answer wouldn't change anything? Why revisit something that everyone else seemed content to leave behind? That reasoning was difficult to argue with, and because it went unchallenged, It became familiar. There were moments later when you noticed a subtle hesitation, a pause before asking new questions, a calculation you hadn't made before. Is this worth asking again? Is this the kind of thing that needs to be clarified? Often you decided it wasn't. You didn't ask again, because the absence of response had trained you. It had taught you that questions don't always lead somewhere, that sometimes they just mark a point of interest before the conversation moves on. And while that's true, it's not the whole truth. Some questions are not meant to be asked once. They require repetition, not to pressure, but to remain present. You didn't ask again, and the question faded from view. But it didn't disappear. It settled into the background, quietly shaping how you listened afterward, how you measured what deserved follow-up, how you decided when curiosity was allowed to persist. I don't believe that every question needs to be asked twice. I still don't. But I've learned that choosing not to ask again is not the same as being satisfied. It's a decision shaped by timing, by comfort, by the ease of letting things stand. You didn't ask again, and the moment passed without interruption. Everything functioned as expected, which is precisely why it took so long to notice that something had shifted, not externally. Internally, the question wasn't answered. It was replaced. And that replacement, that quiet acceptance, is often how questions end. Not with clarity, not with refusal, but with a silence that feels complete, only because no one challenged it. You didn't ask again, and the world continued, unchanged, which is why the question stayed with you long after the moment itself was gone.